My name is Sarah Mercer, and I'm 28 years old. This happened last October, during one of my solo trips for an article I was writing about forgotten ghost stories in rural America. At the time, I was living out of my RV, bouncing from one small town to the next, chasing local legends and eerie tales. It was a way to keep my freelance journalism career afloat, and, if I'm honest, to distract myself from the mess my life had become after my breakup. I'd heard about an abandoned church deep in Sabine National Forest on the Louisiana-Texas border. Locals called it the Devil's Choir because of the ghostly singing people claimed to hear at night. The story sounded like a perfect fit for my article, so I drove out to see it for myself. I didn't believe in ghosts, but the thought of uncovering the truth behind the legend thrilled me. I didn't realize the truth would leave me scarred in ways I still can't explain. The road to the church was rough, a narrow dirt trail that twisted through dense pine trees and muddy ditches. By the time I reached the clearing, my RV's fridge had stopped working, and my phone had lost all signal. The spot was isolated just how I liked it, with the church sitting at the center of a graveyard overrun by weeds and moss. The building itself was small and decrepit, its wooden walls blackened by time and rot. The roof sagged in the middle, and the windows were broken, jagged shards of glass still clinging to the frames. I stepped out of the RV and stared at the church. It felt wrong somehow, like the forest around it was holding its breath. The air was heavy and still, and even the birds seemed reluctant to sing. I told myself it was just my imagination and grabbed my camera to take some pictures. Inside, the church smelled of damp wood and decay. The pews were splintered, and the pulpit had collapsed into a heap of rotting boards. On one wall, someone had scrawled symbols in faded red paint, circles, crosses, and other shapes I didn't recognize. A Bible lay on the floor, its pages yellowed and torn. When I picked it up, I noticed strange markings scribbled in the margins. Words like sacrifice and eternal choir jumped out at me. It was unsettling, but I figured it was probably the work of some teenagers trying to scare people off. The first night was quiet, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stayed up late, writing notes about the church and its strange history. According to my research, the pastor who had led the congregation in the 1800s was rumored to have been part of a cult. One night, the entire congregation vanished without a trace. Some said they'd fled after uncovering the pastor's dark practices, while others believed they were killed in a ritual gone wrong. The stories varied, but they all agreed on one thing: the church was cursed. As I settled into bed, I noticed how silent the forest had become. No wind, no crickets, nothing. I tried to ignore it, but a faint sound crept into the silence. A soft, lilting melody, like a choir humming a hymn. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but it grew louder, echoing faintly through the trees. It wasn't beautiful, it was discordant, each note slightly off, like an out-of-tune piano. I sat up, my pulse quickening, and grabbed my flashlight. The sound stopped the moment I stepped outside. The only thing I saw was the dark outline of the church against the moonlit sky. The next morning, I decided to explore the graveyard. Most of the tombstones were too weathered to read, but a few still bore names and dates. The most recent grave was from 1872, around the time the congregation vanished. At the edge of the cemetery near the tree line, I found a small pile of animal bones. They were arranged in a circle, like someone had placed them there deliberately. I took a picture, feeling a little uneasy but still skeptical. Nature has its own way of being creepy sometimes, I told myself. As I walked back toward the church, I spotted a man standing by the RV. He was tall and thin, his clothes ragged and stained. He didn't look threatening, but something about him made me uneasy. "Can I help you?" I called out. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and raspy. I frowned. "Excuse me." "This place is cursed," he continued, his eyes darting toward the church. "They're still here. They'll make you sing." Before I could respond, he turned and walked into the woods, disappearing between the trees. I wanted to call after him, but a chill ran down my spine that stopped me. His words echoed in my head. "They'll make you sing." That night, the singing returned. It was louder this time, more distinct, and unmistakably coming from the direction of the church. My heart raced as I listened, frozen in my bed. The melody was haunting, a hymn that seemed to pull at something deep inside me. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, determined to find the source. The church door creaked open as I approached, the sound loud and jarring in the quiet night. My flashlight beam swept over the pews, the pulpit, and the walls, but nothing moved. The singing stopped as soon as I entered, leaving me in suffocating silence. Then I saw them. Shadows flitting across the walls, moving as if cast by people walking, though no one was there. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling. The shadows froze. For a moment, everything was still. Then a loud bang echoed through the church as the Bible I'd seen earlier flew off the floor, landing at my feet. I bolted out of the church and back to the RV, locking the door behind me. The next day, I found a journal in the church, tucked beneath one of the broken pews. The cover was cracked leather, and the pages were brittle with age. The entries were written in neat cursive and described the thoughts of a woman named Lydia, a member of the congregation. Her words painted a picture of growing fear and unease as the pastor's sermons became darker and more cryptic. "He says the songs will bring salvation," one entry read. "But I hear them in my dreams now, and they do not sound holy, they sound like mourning." The final entry was short and chilling. "We are the choir now. He will not let us go." That night, the singing didn't stop. It grew louder, filling the air with a discordant harmony that seemed to come from all directions. The RV began to shake, as if something or someone was trying to force its way inside. I clutched the journal, my breath coming in shallow gasps, and tried to think. I knew I couldn't stay. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't something I could explain or fight. Desperate, I decided to burn the journal. If Lydia's words were tied to the curse, maybe destroying them would break it. I grabbed a can of lighter fluid and headed back to the church, my legs trembling with every step. Inside, the air was thick and stifling, as if the building itself was alive and breathing. The shadows on the walls twisted and writhed, and the choir's voices swelled, drowning out my thoughts. I placed the journal on the altar and doused it in lighter fluid, my hands shaking as I struck a match. The moment the flame touched the pages, the voices turned to screams, anguished, furious, and deafening. The shadows surged toward me, but the fire roared to life, consuming the journal and spreading to the altar. I stumbled back as the flames climbed the walls, licking at the rafters. The screams faded, replaced by a heavy silence. I barely made it out before the church collapsed in on itself, sending a plume of smoke into the night sky. Back at the RV, I drove until I reached the nearest road, not caring about the damage to the engine, or the fact that I'd left most of my supplies behind. To this day, I can't explain what happened in Sabine National Forest. The church is gone, but the memories linger, and sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think I can still hear the faint echo of the Devil's Choir. My name is Sarah Mercer, and I'm 28 years old. This happened last October, during one of my solo trips for an article I was writing about forgotten ghost stories in rural America. At the time, I was living out of my RV, bouncing from one small town to the next, chasing local legends and eerie tales. It was a way to keep my freelance journalism career afloat, and if I'm honest, to distract myself from the mess my life had become after my breakup. I'd heard about an abandoned church deep in Sabine National Forest on the Louisiana-Texas border. Locals called it the Devil's Choir because of the ghostly singing people claimed to hear at night. The story sounded like a perfect fit for my article, so I drove out to see it for myself. I didn't believe in ghosts, but the thought of uncovering the truth behind the legend thrilled me. I didn't realize the truth would leave me scarred in ways I still can't explain. The road to the church was rough, a narrow dirt trail that twisted through dense pine trees and muddy ditches. By the time I reached the clearing, my RV's fridge had stopped working, and my phone had lost all signal. The spot was isolated, just how I liked it, with the church sitting at the center of a graveyard overrun by weeds and moss. The building itself was small and decrepit, its wooden walls blackened by time and rot. The roof sagged in the middle, and the windows were broken, jagged shards of glass still clinging to the frames. I stepped out of the RV and stared at the church. It felt wrong somehow, like the forest around it was holding its breath. The air was heavy and still, and even the birds seemed reluctant to sing. I told myself it was just my imagination and grabbed my camera to take some pictures. Inside, the church smelled of damp wood and decay. The pews were splintered, and the pulpit had collapsed into a heap of rotting boards. On one wall, someone had scrawled symbols in faded red paint, circles, crosses, and other shapes I didn't recognize. A Bible lay on the floor, its pages yellowed and torn. When I picked it up, I noticed strange markings scribbled in the margins. Words like sacrifice and eternal choir jumped out at me. It was unsettling, but I figured it was probably the work of some teenagers trying to scare people off. The first night was quiet, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stayed up late, writing notes about the church and its strange history. According to my research, the pastor who had led the congregation in the 1800s was rumored to have been part of a cult. One night, the entire congregation vanished without a trace. Some said they'd fled after uncovering the pastor's dark practices, while others believed they were killed in a ritual gone wrong. The stories varied, but they all agreed on one thing: the church was cursed. As I settled into bed, I noticed how silent the forest had become. No wind, no crickets, nothing. I tried to ignore it, but a faint sound crept into the silence. A soft, lilting melody, like a choir humming a hymn. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but it grew louder, echoing faintly through the trees. It wasn't beautiful, it was discordant, each note slightly off, like an out-of-tune piano. I sat up, my pulse quickening, and grabbed my flashlight. The sound stopped the moment I stepped outside. The only thing I saw was the dark outline of the church against the moonlit sky. The next morning, I decided to explore the graveyard. Most of the tombstones were too weathered to read, but a few still bore names and dates. The most recent grave was from 1872, around the time the congregation vanished. At the edge of the cemetery near the tree line, I found a small pile of animal bones. They were arranged in a circle, like someone had placed them there deliberately. I took a picture, feeling a little uneasy but still skeptical. Nature has its own way of being creepy sometimes, I told myself. As I walked back toward the church, I spotted a man standing by the RV. He was tall and thin, his clothes ragged and stained. He didn't look threatening, but something about him made me uneasy. "Can I help you?" I called out. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and raspy. I frowned. "Excuse me?" "This place is cursed," he continued, his eyes darting toward the church. They're still here. They'll make you sing." Before I could respond, he turned and walked into the woods, disappearing between the trees. I wanted to call after him, but a chill ran down my spine that stopped me. His words echoed in my head. "They'll make you sing." That night, the singing returned. It was louder this time, more distinct, and unmistakably coming from the direction of the church. My heart raced as I listened, frozen in my bed. The melody was haunting, a hymn that seemed to pull at something deep inside me. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, determined to find the source. The church door creaked open as I approached, the sound loud and jarring in the quiet night. My flashlight beam swept over the pews, the pulpit, and the walls, but nothing moved. The singing stopped as soon as I entered, leaving me in suffocating silence. Then I saw them. Shadows flitting across the walls, moving as if cast by people walking, though no one was there. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. The shadows froze. For a moment, everything was still. Then a loud bang echoed through the church as the Bible I'd seen earlier flew off the floor, landing at my feet. I bolted out of the church and back to the RV, locking the door behind me. The next day, I found a journal in the church, tucked beneath one of the broken pews. The cover was cracked leather, and the pages were brittle with age. The entries were written in neat cursive and described the thoughts of a woman named Lydia, a member of the congregation. Her words painted a picture of growing fear and unease as the pastor's sermons became darker and more cryptic. "He says the songs will bring salvation," one entry read, "but I hear them in my dreams now, and they do not sound holy, they sound like mourning." The final entry was short and chilling. "We are the choir now. He will not let us go." That night, the singing didn't stop. It grew louder, filling the air with a discordant harmony that seemed to come from all directions. The RV began to shake, as if something, or someone, was trying to force its way inside. I clutched the journal, my breath coming in shallow gasps, and tried to think. I knew I couldn't stay. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't something I could explain or fight. Desperate, I decided to burn the journal. If Lydia's words were tied to the curse, maybe destroying them would break it. I grabbed a can of lighter fluid and headed back to the church, my legs trembling with every step. Inside, the air was thick and stifling, as if the building itself was alive and breathing. The shadows on the walls twisted and writhed, and the choir's voices swelled, drowning out my thoughts. I placed the journal on the altar and doused it in lighter fluid, my hands shaking as I struck a match. The moment the flame touched the pages, the voices turned to screams, anguished, furious, and deafening. The shadows surged toward me, but the fire roared to life, consuming the journal and spreading to the altar. I stumbled back as the flames climbed the walls, licking at the rafters. The screams faded, replaced by a heavy silence. I barely made it out before the church collapsed in on itself, sending a plume of smoke into the night sky. Back at the RV, I drove until I reached the nearest road, not caring about the damage to the engine or the fact that I'd left most of my supplies behind. To this day, I can't explain what happened in Sabine National Forest. The church is gone, but the memories linger. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think I can still hear the faint echo of the devil's choir. My name is Emma Ross, and I'm 29 years old. This happened about a year ago when my best friend Chris convinced me to join him and our mutual friend Taylor on a camping trip deep in the swamps of Louisiana. It was supposed to be a fun, relaxing weekend, but I should have known better. When Chris is involved, things rarely go according to plan. We'd parked the RV in a remote spot near Bayou Noir, a place Chris picked specifically because of its creepy reputation. Locals whispered about a ghostly witch named Marie Lagrange, said to haunt the bayou after being drowned by an angry mob in the 1800s. I didn't believe in ghosts, but I figured the trip would be a good chance to get away from the city and take some moody swamp photos for my portfolio. Chris, of course, saw it differently. At 30, he was still chasing a dream of becoming a famous paranormal investigator. He wanted to film the entire trip for his YouTube channel, despite the fact that he barely had any subscribers. Taylor, who was 27 and easily spooked, had only come along because she didn't want to be left out. Between her nerves and Chris's antics, I figured I'd be playing referee most of the weekend. The drive to the campsite was uneventful, though the farther we got from civilization, the heavier the air seemed to feel. By the time we arrived, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the water. Cypress trees loomed over us, their branches draped with Spanish moss that swayed in a faint, eerie breeze. The RV sputtered to a stop on uneven ground, and Chris jumped out, camera in hand. "Look at this place," he said, sweeping the camera toward the bayou. "Creepy as hell, perfect for a ghost hunt." Taylor rolled her eyes. "Perfect for getting bitten by mosquitoes." I grabbed my camera and started snapping photos of the scenery. The bayou was hauntingly beautiful, but there was a stillness to it that set my teeth on edge. Even the usual sounds of nature, birdsong, the chirping of crickets, seemed muted. I chalked it up to being in an unfamiliar place and tried to shake the feeling. We set up camp, but things started going wrong almost immediately. The RV's generator sputtered out, leaving us without power. Chris muttered something about bad luck and dragged out some battery-powered lanterns. The damp air soaked into everything, and the firewood we'd brought wouldn't catch. Taylor was already grumbling about leaving when Chris suggested we explore the area. "Let's check out that clearing over there," he said, pointing to a gap in the trees. "Might be where the witch was drowned." "You don't know that," I said, but he was already heading off, his camera light cutting through the gloom. The clearing was small and overgrown, with a strange collection of objects hanging from one of the trees. There were rusty nails tied with red string, bones that looked disturbingly human, and bits of cloth that fluttered in the faint breeze. Taylor stopped dead. "What the hell is that?" "Probably some kind of voodoo thing," Chris said, grinning as he filmed it. "Or maybe just a prank." "It's creepy," Taylor said. "Let's go back." Chris ignored her, circling the tree with his camera. I snapped a few photos, though the sight of the objects made my skin crawl. I wasn't sure why, but I felt like we were being watched. That night, the first strange thing happened. As we sat around the fire trying to laugh off the day's weirdness, we heard it, a faint, rhythmic splashing from the bayou. At first, we thought it was an animal, but the sound was too deliberate, too steady, like someone walking through the water. Chris grabbed his camera. "Stay here, I'm checking it out." "You're insane," Taylor hissed, but he was already heading toward the sound. Against my better judgment, I followed him, leaving Taylor by the fire. We searched the edge of the bayou but found nothing. The water was dark and still, the splashing sound gone. Chris seemed disappointed, but I was relieved. We returned to the campsite only to find Taylor wide-eyed and shaking. "Someone was out here," she said. "I heard footsteps and the RV door was open." I checked the RV, but everything seemed untouched. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was right. The second night was worse. I woke to the sound of something tapping on the RV window. It was faint at first, almost like rain, but when I sat up, I saw muddy handprints smeared across the glass. My stomach turned. I woke Chris and Taylor, but by the time they looked, the prints were gone. Chris was thrilled. "This is it. proof of paranormal activity. Taylor was furious. "This isn't a game, Chris. We need to leave." But Chris wouldn't hear it. He was convinced we were on the brink of something big. Reluctantly, I stayed, if only to keep Taylor calm. The next day, I found something that made my blood run cold. While wandering near the bayou, I spotted a figure in the water. A woman in a white dress, standing ankle-deep and staring right at me. Her face was pale and blurred, like an old photograph. When I blinked, she was gone. I told Chris and Taylor, but Chris just laughed. "You're finally starting to see the good stuff," he said. Taylor, however, looked terrified. That night, things escalated. The RV rocked violently, as if something or someone was trying to tip it over. Chris's camera malfunctioned, the screen flashing with static. Taylor screamed as shadowy figures darted past the windows, their shapes inhuman. I could barely breathe as a voice, low and guttural, echoed from the trees. The final straw came when Chris tried to perform a summoning ritual. He'd found it online, some nonsense about calling the spirit of Marie Lagrange. He lit candles and muttered the words, but as soon as he started, the air grew heavy, and a foul smell filled the campsite. "Stop," I begged him. "You're making it worse." But it was too late. The candles flickered out and Chris froze, his eyes rolling back. When he spoke, his voice wasn't his own. It was deep and raspy, filled with malice. "Get out," he growled. "You don't belong here." Taylor screamed, and I grabbed Chris, shaking him until he snapped out of it. He collapsed, gasping for air, but the damage was done. The witch was angry. Desperate, I searched online for anything about appeasing Marie's spirit. I found a local legend that said she could be calmed with an offering of respect at her burial site. We packed what little we had left and set off into the bayou, hoping to find the cross that marked her grave. The journey was harrowing. The fog thickened until we could barely see, and the air was filled with whispers that seemed to come from all around us. Branches clawed at our clothes, and the water churned with unseen forces. Finally, we found it. A moss-covered stone cross half submerged in the water. Chris, shaken but determined, placed his camera at the base as an apology for exploiting her story. I added a photograph of my mother, hoping it would show sincerity. Taylor scattered salt in a circle, muttering prayers under her breath. Marie appeared then, her form shimmering like heat waves. Her face was twisted with rage, but as she looked at our offerings, her expression softened. She spoke, her voice like a breeze through dead leaves. "Leave," she said, "and never return." As she faded, the water around the cross began to bubble. Chris screamed as something unseen dragged him under, but after a few seconds he was spat back out, coughing and shivering. We didn't wait to see what would happen next. We fled to the RV and drove until we were miles away. Chris deleted his footage, Taylor refused to speak, and I stared out the window, my mind racing. I don't know if we escaped Marie's curse or if she's still watching, waiting for someone else to disturb her peace. All I know is I'll never go back to Bayou Teche. Some places are better left alone. My name is Marcus Reed. I'm 38 years old, and this happened in late October, when the days were getting shorter and the nights felt a little colder. I had taken a trip to Bayou Teche in Louisiana to trace my family history. It was supposed to be simple. A few days of digging through local records, exploring the ruins of an old plantation tied to my ancestors, and taking some time to enjoy the quiet beauty of the bayou. I'm a history teacher, but genealogy has always been a hobby of mine. I love uncovering the stories of the past, the ones that get forgotten over time. But there are some stories that don't want to stay buried. The first day of the trip was uneventful. I parked my RV in a clearing near the water, not far from a narrow dirt road. The place was peaceful, with the cypress trees casting long shadows over the bayou and their mossy tendrils swaying gently in the breeze. I spent the afternoon going through some notes I'd gathered on my ancestors, a branch of the Reed family who had owned a plantation in this area back in the 1800s. At sunset, I drove into the nearby town of St. Martinville to visit a small local museum. The curator, Ella Marie Guidry, was waiting for me. She was a kind-looking woman in her 60s, with deep brown eyes and a voice thick with a Cajun accent. "So, you're looking for the Reed plantation," she said, sorting through some old maps. "That land's been swallowed up by the bayou, not much left now but ruins." "That's what I'm hoping to see," I said. "Do you know anything about the history of the plantation?" Her face darkened. "Some," she said carefully. "It was abandoned during the cholera outbreak in 1853. A lot of folks around here died back then, whole families wiped out. But there's one story tied to that place you might not like." I leaned in, curious. "They say the plantation owners left the sick children behind when they fled, put them in the swamp, hoping it'd stop the disease from spreading. Some say you can still hear them crying out there, calling for their parents." The way she said it sent a chill down my spine, but I forced a smile. "Sounds like a ghost story to me." "Maybe it is," she said. "But some stories stick around for a reason. Be careful if you go out there." That night, I sat in my RV, flipping through the old maps Ella Marie had given me. I'd marked a spot she mentioned, a place deep in the bayou where the plantation ruins might still be found. The thought of exploring such a hidden piece of history excited me. It was close to midnight when I first heard the sound, a faint splash in the water, followed by soft, high-pitched giggles. I froze, my pen hovering over the map. The sound came again, louder this time, just outside the RV. I peered through the window but saw nothing but the dark water and the faint shimmer of moonlight on the cypress trees. "Probably just animals," I muttered, forcing myself to relax. But something about the laughter didn't sit right. It was too human. The next morning, I packed my gear and set out for the ruins. The trail was barely visible, overgrown with weeds and tangled roots, but the map guided me well enough. The deeper I went, the quieter the bayou became. The usual hum of insects faded, replaced by an uneasy silence. After about an hour, I found it, a cluster of crumbling stone walls, half hidden by moss and vines. The plantation ruins. The air felt heavier here, the light dimmer even in broad daylight. As I stepped closer, my boot caught on something half buried in the mud. I bent down and pulled it free, a small muddy shoe, worn and decayed. It couldn't have been more than 5 inches long, the size a child might wear. A chill prickled the back of my neck. "Just a coincidence," I said out loud, trying to shake off the unease. I continued exploring and eventually found what looked like an old ledger book, its leather cover warped with age. Inside were brittle, water-stained pages covered in neat, spidery handwriting. One entry caught my attention. July 3rd, 1853. The children grow worse. We've no choice but to leave them. May God forgive us. I closed the book, my hands trembling. I didn't believe in ghosts, but the thought of those abandoned children haunted me. That night, the laughter returned. It started faint, just like before, but quickly grew louder. This time, it wasn't just giggles. I heard whispers, soft voices calling my name. "Marcus, play with us." My heart pounded as I stared at the RV door. A faint thump echoed from outside, then another. Something was walking around out there. I grabbed a flashlight and swung it toward the window. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, a small figure darting between the trees. Then came the handprints. Dozens of muddy handprints appeared on the windows, small and child-sized. They smeared and dragged down the glass as if invisible hands were clawing to get inside. I backed away, panic gripping me. "This isn't real," I whispered. "It's just in my head." The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Marcus, come outside." The next morning, I drove back to St. Martinville and told Ella Marie what had happened. Her face turned pale as I described the handprints and the voices. "You shouldn't have gone out there," she said. "Those children aren't just stories. They're real, and they're angry." "Angry at what?" I asked. She hesitated, then said, "At being forgotten." She handed me a bundle of sage and a small vial of salt water. "Go back to the ruins," she said. "Apologize. Leave something behind to show you remember them. It's the only way to make them stop." That evening, I returned to the ruins, armed with the sage, the salt water, and the ledger book. The bayou felt different this time, darker, heavier, as if the air itself was pressing down on me. When I reached the ruins, they were waiting. Dozens of ghostly figures stood among the trees, their eyes glowing faintly in the twilight. They were children, their forms translucent and ragged, their faces pale and hollow. One of them stepped forward, a little girl clutching a stuffed doll. "Why did you leave us?" she asked, her voice small and broken. "I didn't," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm here to remember you. I'm here to tell your story." I placed the ledger book on the ground and sprinkled the salt water over the ruins. The children watched in silence as I lit the sage and waved the smoke around the area. "I'm sorry," I said, "for what happened to you, for the way they left you. You deserved better." The little girl tilted her head, her expression unreadable. Then, one by one, the children began to fade, their forms dissolving into the mist. By the time I made it back to my RV, the sun had risen, casting a warm glow over the bayou. The muddy handprints were gone, and the air felt lighter. After I left Bayou Teche that day, carrying the ledger with me, I wrote an article about the plantation, telling the story of the children who were left behind. Some truths are painful, but they deserve to be remembered. My name is Becky Green, and I'm 27 years old. This happened in May of last year, when I decided to spend a few nights camping in Honey Island Swamp, Louisiana. I wasn't there for fun. I was there to write a blog post debunking the local legends, the Honey Island swamp monster, ghost sightings, and stories about skinwalkers. I've always been skeptical, but I love folklore. So, with my RV packed, a camera slung over my shoulder, and a notebook ready to jot down quirky local tales, I set off for what I thought would be a peaceful, productive trip. I should have listened to the warnings. The trip started off rocky. My GPS went haywire halfway there, throwing me down unfamiliar back roads surrounded by thick trees. I eventually stopped at a gas station to buy a map, an actual paper map, and ended up losing an hour trying to figure out where I was. By the time I arrived, dusk was already falling, painting the swamp in shades of gold and shadow. I parked my RV in a clearing by the water. The place was breathtaking, draped in ancient cypress trees dripping with moss. The swamp was quiet, save for the soft croaking of frogs and the hum of insects. It was perfect, remote, and undisturbed. Just what I needed for photos and immersion. That first night was uneventful, though I did notice how unusually dark it got. Without streetlights or moonlight breaking through the canopy, it felt like the swamp swallowed the light. I stayed up late, scrolling through my camera roll and making notes. Around midnight, I thought I heard a faint rustling outside, but when I peeked through the RV window, nothing was there. I chalked it up to an animal. The next morning, I headed deeper into the swamp to explore. Honey Island had its charm, with its murky waters and twisted trees that seemed to lean in as if they had secrets to whisper. The trails were poorly marked, but I didn't care. This was my element: nature, quiet, and no distractions. About 2 miles in, I found something that made me pause: a set of tracks in the mud. At first, they looked like animal prints, but as I examined them closer, they morphed into something odd. The pads and claws of an animal faded into what looked like the shape of a human foot, barefoot, no less. "Probably someone messing around," I muttered, snapping a photo for the blog. The day only got stranger. The swamp was unusually quiet. No birds, no frogs, no rustling leaves, just silence. As I returned to my RV, I caught a faint whiff of something that made my stomach turn. It was the sour, cloying scent of decay. It was gone as quickly as it came, leaving me standing there with goosebumps. Back at my RV, I ran into a local guide named JJ. He was in his late 30s with a weathered face and a skeptical glare. I flagged him down to ask about trails, and he glanced over my gear with a mix of pity and disapproval. "Shouldn't be out here alone," he said gruffly. "People get lost. Worse things happen too." "Worse things?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. He hesitated, then gestured toward the swamp. "This place has rules. Stay on marked trails. Don't go poking around at night. And don't mess with anything that ain't yours." I smiled politely and thanked him for the advice, but I didn't take him seriously. This was the kind of local folklore I'd come to write about. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, the swamp transformed. Shadows stretched longer, and the cypress trees seemed to loom closer. I was sitting in my RV editing photos when I heard it, my name, Becky. It was faint, almost like a whisper, but it was there. My heart skipped and I froze, straining to hear it again. "Becky?" It came again, clearer this time, from the direction of the water. Slowly, I crept to the window and peered out. Nothing. Just the swamp, dark and still. I told myself it was my imagination. I even laughed nervously, convincing myself it was the wind. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next morning, I went to check the tracks I'd found, hoping to photograph them again. When I reached the spot, they were gone. In their place was fresh mud, like something had purposefully erased them. A chill ran down my spine, but I shook it off. As I walked back, I spotted a small cabin tucked behind a curtain of mossy trees. Curious, I knocked on the door, and an old woman answered. She introduced herself as Mrs. Laverne, her voice thick with a Cajun accent. "You shouldn't be out here alone," she said, after I explained what I was doing. Her cloudy eyes looked right through me. The swamp spirit don't take kindly to strangers. I laughed nervously. "What spirit is that?" She didn't answer. Instead, she pressed a small handmade talisman into my hand, a bundle of sticks tied with twine and stained with what looked like ash. "Keep this with you," she said. "It might help." I thanked her and left, though I didn't believe a word of it. That night was worse. Much worse. I was in my RV, going over the day's notes, when I heard JJ's voice. "Becky, help!" It was coming from the woods. My heart raced. He sounded desperate. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped outside. "JJ," I called, my voice trembling. "Help me." The voice came again, farther into the trees. I hesitated. Something about it felt off, like the voice was hollow, forced. But what if JJ was hurt? I couldn't just ignore it. As I walked toward the trees, the scent of decay returned, stronger this time. I gagged, covering my nose. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. And that's when I saw it. A figure stood in the shadows, half hidden by the trees. At first, I thought it was JJ, but as it stepped closer, my stomach turned. It was wrong. Its limbs were too long, its face pale and distorted. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in a dying fire. "Becky," it said, mimicking JJ's voice. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. The thing tilted its head, watching me like a predator sizing up its prey. Then it lunged. I screamed and ran, tripping over roots and branches. I barely made it back to my RV, slamming the door behind me and locking it. The thing scratched at the walls, its nails screeching against the metal. The next morning, JJ found me pale and shaking in the RV. He took one look at me and nodded grimly. "You saw it," he said. I told him everything, and his face grew darker with each word. "That's no swamp monster," he said. "That's a skinwalker, or something like it. It can take the shape of people, animals, whatever it wants, and it doesn't stop." "What does it want?" I asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he told me to pack up and leave before nightfall. I didn't make it. While packing my gear, I heard my mother's voice, soft, familiar, and unmistakable. "Becky, sweetie, come here." My blood turned to ice. She was hundreds of miles away, back home. But the voice, it was perfect. I froze, torn between running and investigating. Then I remembered the talisman. Digging it out of my bag, I clutched it tightly. The voice faltered, distorting like a scratched record. A shadow passed by the RV window, and the thing outside snarled, guttural and angry. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the RV, gripping the talisman and staring at the door, waiting for dawn. When the sun finally rose, I left Honey Island Swamp without looking back. I never posted the blog. Some things are better left alone. My name is Alex Carter, and I'm 29 years old. This happened a few months ago, in late spring, during a solo RV trip through Louisiana. I thought I was taking a peaceful break from life, spending some quiet time by the bayou. What I encountered instead was something that still keeps me awake at night, something that changed me forever. It was a Friday afternoon when I arrived at Bayou Teche near Bro Bridge. I had parked my RV in a designated area by the water. My plan was simple: spend the weekend unwinding, sketching the bayou, and maybe learning about some local legends. I had always been fascinated by ghost stories, especially ones rooted in history. Bayou Teche had plenty of those, but one stood out: the lost children of Ghost Bridge. The locals said they were orphans taken by a sinister force, their laughter and cries still echoing in the swamp. I told myself I didn't believe in ghosts, but that legend struck a nerve. Maybe it was because I was still carrying guilt over losing one of my students last year during a field trip. It was an accident. A slip, a fall, a moment of carelessness, but it had been enough to crush me. Maybe digging into stories like this was my way of making sense of what I couldn't change. The first person I met at the bayou was a man named Bernard. I found him sitting in a battered old chair outside a shack near the visitor center, feeding scraps of bread to a raccoon. He was a wiry man with sharp features and a voice like gravel. "You're parked near Ghost Bridge, aren't you?" he asked as soon as I introduced myself. I nodded. "I heard there's some history there, something about children." His face darkened. "More than history. You'd do well to stay away from that bridge, especially after dark." I smiled politely, assuming it was just local superstition. "I'm just here to look around, maybe write a little." Bernard stared at me, his eyes narrowing. "I mean it. The bridge don't like visitors, neither do the ones who linger there." Before I could ask him to elaborate, he waved me off and went inside his shack, muttering something about fools and warnings. That evening, the swamp came alive with sounds. chirping frogs, rustling leaves, the distant croak of herons. The peaceful atmosphere helped me push Bernard's warnings out of my mind. I sat by the water, sketchbook in hand, drawing the reflection of the cypress trees on the still surface. As the sun dipped lower, I noticed the quiet creeping in. The frogs stopped. The herons went silent. Even the breeze seemed to hold its breath. Then I heard it. Laughter, high-pitched, fleeting, like a group of children playing hide-and-seek. It was faint, carried on the wind, but unmistakable. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. I scanned the area with my flashlight, but saw nothing. The sound stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving me in unsettling silence. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I locked the RV door that night anyway. The next morning, I decided to hike the trail leading to Ghost Bridge. It wasn't far from the campsite, just a short walk along a dirt path winding through thick, overgrown trees. The bridge itself was in bad shape. The wooden planks warped and broken, the metal rails rusted and covered in moss. A sign nearby warned that the structure was unsafe, but curiosity tugged me forward. The closer I got, the colder the air seemed to grow. It wasn't a natural chill, but something that sank into my bones, making me shiver despite the humid morning. I was about to turn back when I noticed something lying in the dirt at the foot of the bridge. A small, weathered doll with one glass eye missing. Its clothes were tattered, its face smeared with mud. I crouched down, my stomach twisting. The doll looked old, older than anything that should have been left out here. I thought about taking a picture for my notes, but decided against it. Something about touching that doll felt wrong. That afternoon I returned to Bernard's shack. He seemed surprised to see me. "You didn't go to the bridge, did you?" he asked, his voice sharp. I hesitated, then nodded. I heard something strange last night. Laughter, and today I found a doll. Bernard's expression hardened. "You should have left it where it was." "I did," I said quickly, "but what's the story really? Who were the children?" He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "They were orphans, taken in by the old parish decades ago. The swamp was their playground, but one night they went missing. Search parties combed the bayou for days, but found nothing. Folks said something took them, something dark that lives in the water. Now they're stuck, caught between here and whatever's beyond. And they're not alone. There's something else, something worse." That night, the RV began acting up. The lights flickered and the radio turned on by itself, playing soft static even though I hadn't touched it. Then I heard them again. The laughter closer this time. I stepped outside, clutching a flashlight, and scanned the area. The beam caught something moving between the trees, small shapes darting through the underbrush, too quick and too shadowy to be human. My breath caught. "Hello?" I called out. The laughter stopped, replaced by whispers so faint I couldn't make out the words. I backed toward the RV, my heart pounding, and locked the door behind me. The next morning, I woke to find muddy handprints on the RV's windows. Tiny handprints like those of children. My stomach dropped, and I quickly packed a bag, determined to leave. But as I started the engine, the RV wouldn't budge. The lights flickered, the engine sputtered, and I sat there gripping the steering wheel, feeling utterly trapped. I knew I couldn't leave until I faced the bridge one last time. That evening, I returned to Ghost Bridge with a flashlight, and the vague hope that confronting whatever was happening would put an end to it. The bayou was eerily quiet as I approached, the shadows long and thick. When I reached the bridge, I saw them. Figures, pale and translucent, standing in the distance. Children. Their faces were blurred, their eyes vacant, and they didn't move, just stood there, watching. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice shaking. One of them stepped forward. A boy no older than 10. His mouth opened, but the sound that came out wasn't a child's voice. It was a deep, guttural growl. "They took us," he said, his voice like gravel. "They'll take you too." The shadows around the children began to shift, coalescing into a larger shape. A figure shrouded in darkness, its form rippling like smoke. The taker. It towered over the children, its hollow eyes locking onto mine. "Leave!" it hissed, its voice echoing through my skull. "Or stay and suffer." I stumbled backward, my flashlight flickering as the shadows surged toward me. I remembered Bernard's story and the journal I'd skimmed earlier in the day. There was a sketch in it, an old charm inscribed with protective symbols used to banish spirits. I fumbled in my bag, pulling out a small medallion I had picked up earlier, a token Bernard had handed me when I first arrived. The shadows hesitated, retreating slightly as I held the charm in front of me. "Let them go," I shouted, my voice trembling. "You don't need them anymore." The taker roared, its form contorting, and the children's figures began to fade. The charm glowed faintly in my hand, and the air around me grew heavier. With one last surge of strength, I threw the charm onto the bridge, and the shadows erupted into a swirling mass of darkness before vanishing entirely. The children were gone. I left Bayou Teche at dawn, the RV finally starting as if nothing had happened. The bridge collapsed later that day, according to the news, a strange coincidence no one could explain. I didn't tell anyone what I saw, but every so often I hear faint laughter in my dreams, accompanied by the sound of whispers. They don't feel threatening anymore, though. They feel grateful, and maybe that's enough to let me sleep at night. My name is Riley Marks, and I'm 33 years old. This happened last fall when I traveled to Black Bayou Lake in northern Louisiana. I was there to write an article on the folklore of Louisiana's most haunted places, but the story I uncovered was something I could never put into print. What I found in the bayou was far too personal and far too terrifying to share with anyone until now. I had been traveling in my RV for a few weeks, chasing legends. I'd interviewed locals about haunted plantations, mysterious swamp creatures, and long-forgotten ghost towns. Black Bayou was meant to be the grand finale, the perfect setting to cap off my piece with its shadowy waters, gnarled cypress trees, and the legend of Dame Sombre. I didn't believe in ghosts, of course. Not really. I thought there might be something to the stories, a flicker of truth twisted into folklore, but nothing supernatural. I was wrong. I arrived at the wildlife refuge late in the afternoon. The golden sunlight filtering through the trees made the bayou look almost peaceful, but there was an underlying silence that unnerved me. No chirping birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my RV tires crunching gravel as I pulled into the visitor center parking lot. A woman stepped out to greet me. She was older, with wiry gray hair tied back in a ponytail and sun-worn skin. Her name tag read Marcy. She gave me a once-over, sizing me up like she'd seen my kind before. "Journalist, huh?" she said as I introduced myself. "Y'all always come poking around here, asking about La Dame." "Is the legend true?" I asked, smiling, trying to put her at ease. She didn't return the smile. "It's true enough. I'll tell you this much. Don't go wandering off after dark. She don't like being disturbed." Before I could press her for more, a man in waders walked past, carrying a fishing pole. He tipped his hat at me and said, "Better listen to her. This place'll play tricks on you if you're not careful." I laughed nervously, but neither of them looked like they were joking. That evening, I parked my RV at the designated campsite near the water. I set up my equipment, camera, audio recorder, and notepad, and waited for the sun to set. The bayou transformed at night. The golden light gave way to an eerie, inky darkness. The trees cast long shadows over the still water, and the air felt heavier, damp, and clinging. I started recording notes, speaking softly into my phone. Day 1, Black Bayou Lake. Locals are tight-lipped about La Dame Sombre, but they all seem to believe in her. Legend says she was a woman betrayed by her lover, who lured her into the bayou and left her to drown. Her spirit's been haunting the water ever since, pulling people under if they get too close. I paused, feeling a chill run down my spine. Somewhere in the distance, I thought I heard humming. It was faint, almost too soft to hear, but unmistakably human. I turned off the recorder and stepped outside, shining my flashlight toward the water. The beam caught the gnarled roots of a cypress tree and nothing else. The humming stopped. The next day, I met a man named Cole at the visitor center. He was loading a small boat onto his truck, his face tanned from years spent on the water. "You the one asking about La Dame?" he asked, spitting into the dirt. I nodded, and he chuckled darkly. "You don't look like the type to believe in ghosts." "I don't," I said. "I'm just writing a story." "Well, here's a story for you." He leaned against his truck, his expression growing serious. "A buddy of mine went out fishing one night, chasing lights he saw on the water. Never came back. We found his boat the next morning, stuck in the reeds. No sign of him, but his pole was still in the water like he'd just stepped away for a second." "What kind of lights?" I asked. "Lanterns, maybe, or something like that. Could have been La Dame luring him in. That's what the old folks say she does. Calls you out there with her singing or her lights, and once you follow her, you're done for." That night, I couldn't sleep. The silence of the bayou pressed against my ears like a weight. The faint humming I'd heard the night before had been easy enough to brush off as my imagination. But Cole's story had settled into my mind, churning like the water below. Around midnight, I heard it again, the humming. This time it was closer, louder, and undeniably real. My heart pounded as I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The beam cut through the darkness, bouncing off the water's surface. At first, I saw nothing. Then, in the distance, a flickering light appeared. It was faint, like the glow of an old oil lantern. I should have gone back inside. Every instinct screamed at me to stay put, to lock the doors, and wait for morning. But something, curiosity, guilt, or maybe sheer stupidity, pushed me forward. I grabbed my boots and a jacket and followed the light. The trail wound through the trees, twisting and turning until I lost sight of my RV entirely. The lantern light bobbed ahead of me, always just out of reach. I called out once, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness. The only response was the soft splash of water as I stepped onto the edge of the bayou. That's when I heard it. A voice. Soft, melodic, and heartbreakingly familiar. "Riley?" I froze. It couldn't be. The voice was faint but unmistakable. Eli, my younger sibling. They'd been missing for nearly 20 years, lost on a camping trip when I was supposed to be watching them. The memory of that day had haunted me ever since, and hearing their voice now sent a chill down my spine. "Eli?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is that you?" The lantern light flickered, and a shadowy figure appeared on the water. It was hard to make out, but the shape was human, standing impossibly still on the surface of the bayou. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but I took a step closer, then another. "Come closer," the voice whispered. "Help me." I was waist-deep in the water before I realized something was wrong. The figure wasn't moving. Its outline shimmered and wavered like smoke, and its eyes, dark, empty hollows, locked onto mine. The humming started again, louder this time, vibrating through my chest. Panic surged through me, and I turned to run, but the water around me began to ripple. Shadowy shapes darted beneath the surface, circling me like predators. I stumbled, falling to my knees, and that's when I saw her. La Dame Sombre rose from the water, her figure impossibly tall and gaunt. Her skin was pale and slick, her hair hanging in wet, tangled strands over her face. Her eyes glowed faintly, and her mouth curved into a jagged, unnatural smile. "You came for them," she said, her voice like a hiss, "but they are not here." I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Her hand reached for me, long and skeletal, dripping with black water. My mind raced, searching for something, anything that could save me. Then I remembered Marcy's warning. I fumbled in my pocket and found the small silver charm she'd given me earlier that day. For luck, she'd said, but I hadn't thought much of it at the time. I held it up, my hand trembling, and the ghost let out an ear-piercing scream. The water around me churned violently, and the shadowy shapes vanished. La Dame Sombre recoiled, her form flickering like a dying flame. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not stopping until I reached the safety of my RV. I left Black Bayou the next morning, my hands still shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. The charm sat on the dashboard, its surface tarnished and warm to the touch. I didn't look back as I drove away, but the haunting melody of her humming stayed with me. Even now, I hear it sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet. I'll wake up drenched in sweat, convinced she's outside my window waiting. And maybe she is. Maybe La Dame Sombre never really lets you go. But there's one thing I know for certain. I won't be writing that article. Some stories are better left untold. My name is Paul Jennings. I'm 45 years old, a history professor, and recently divorced. Last spring, something happened to me that I can barely put into words. People think that because I study the past, I'm obsessed with stories. That's true to an extent. I've always loved piecing together mysteries, peeling back the layers of time to uncover the truth. But I never expected to live through one of those mysteries myself. This happened in March, just after my divorce was finalized. I needed space, both from the people who thought they were helping and from the mess I'd made of my life. So I did what I always do when I need clarity. I hit the road in a rented RV. My plan was to camp at a place I'd read about, Whispering Pines Campground, on the edge of Lake Pontchartrain in Louisiana. It was remote, quiet, and steeped in the kind of folklore that made for excellent material for the book I'd been working on about Southern legends. The campground was infamous for the story of the hanged children. Supposedly, in the late 1800s, a religious cult called the Sons of Purity had executed a group of orphans in the woods as part of a ritual. Locals claimed their spirits still haunted the place, appearing to warn visitors, or worse, to lure them to their deaths. It was the perfect mix of macabre and fascinating, exactly what I needed to distract myself. The campground was even more rundown than I expected. The sign at the entrance, barely legible beneath layers of moss, swung lazily in the humid breeze. The office was a shack with peeling paint, where a teenage girl sat behind the counter, scrolling on her phone. "Y'all here for the weekend?" she asked, not looking up. "Just me," I said. "Paul Jennings." That got her attention. She looked up, squinting at me as though sizing me up. "Whispering Pines ain't real busy these days. You sure you want to stay here? People say it's haunted." I smiled politely. "That's why I'm here. I'm a historian, researching local legends." She raised an eyebrow. "Well, don't say I didn't warn you." As she handed me the key to the RV pad, she leaned closer. If you hear laughing at night, don't go outside. That's them kids. They don't like strangers. I chuckled awkwardly, but her expression didn't change. The campground was eerily empty. Most of the RV spots were overgrown with weeds, and the few cabins scattered among the trees looked like they hadn't been used in years. My pad was near the edge of the woods, far from the other campers, if there were any. That night, as I cooked dinner, the quiet began to settle into my bones. I'd never realized how loud my normal life was until I was surrounded by silence. Even the usual hum of crickets and frogs seemed subdued, like the swamp itself was holding its breath. It wasn't until I turned off the lights and lay down in my bed that I heard it. Faint, high-pitched laughter carried on the breeze. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Then I thought it might be another camper, maybe some kids playing a prank. But the laughter grew louder, closer, until it seemed to circle the RV. I got up, peering out the window, but saw nothing but shadows. The laughter faded as quickly as it had begun. I told myself it was just the wind and went back to bed, though it took me hours to fall asleep. The next morning, I woke to find something strange on the window. Tiny, muddy handprints smeared across the glass. I stared at them for a long time, trying to convince myself they were nothing. Maybe they'd been there when I arrived and I just hadn't noticed. Maybe they were a prank. Maybe. As I sipped my coffee, I noticed a middle-aged couple at a nearby RV. The woman, Evelyn, waved me over. She was friendly, though her husband, Jacob, barely glanced up from his folding chair. "You're the new guy, right?" Evelyn asked, her voice warm but tinged with concern. "You hear them kids last night?" "I heard something," I admitted, feeling foolish for even saying it out loud. "Probably just wildlife." Evelyn shook her head. "It ain't wildlife. I saw them years ago, pale little things hanging from the trees. We don't come here often anymore, but when we do, I make sure to leave before dark." Her husband snorted. "Ghost stories. Load of nonsense." But Evelyn looked at me with a seriousness that made my skin crawl. "If you're smart, you'll leave before tonight." Despite Evelyn's warning, I stayed. I spent the day exploring the woods, taking notes on the legends of the campground. The deeper I went, the darker the forest seemed to grow, the tall pines blocking out most of the sunlight. After about an hour of wandering, I found it. The tree. It was massive, its gnarled branches stretching out like skeletal arms. Frayed ropes dangled from several of the limbs, their fibers darkened by time and weather. Around the base of the tree were carvings in the bark, crude stick figures with hollow circles for heads. Some of the figures were hanging, others running, and a few kneeling as though in prayer. My breath caught in my throat as I took it all in. I wasn't sure what unsettled me more, the sheer age of the carvings or the feeling that someone or something was watching me. When I returned to my RV, I found something waiting for me on the step. A doll made of sticks and moss, its head a small round stone with hollow eyes. I froze, my pulse racing. Someone was playing a sick joke, or the stories were more than just stories. That night, the laughter returned. It was louder, more persistent, and accompanied by faint whispers I couldn't quite make out. This time, I didn't go to the window. Instead, I sat in the dark, clutching the flashlight I'd brought with me, trying to convince myself it wasn't real. Around midnight, the RV door rattled. My breath hitched as I stared at the lock, watching it shake violently as though someone or something was trying to get in. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The rattling stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, in a voice that sounded like a child's, a whisper drifted through the door. "Come play." I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I met Lila again at the check-in station. I told her about what I'd experienced, expecting her to laugh it off. But instead, she grew serious. "They're warning you," she said. "But they're mad you stayed. They don't like it when people ignore the signs." "What signs?" I asked, exasperated. "You'll know," she said cryptically before disappearing into the shack. When I returned to my RV, I found myself writing in my notebook without realizing it. At first, it was just disjointed phrases. The tree is the gate. The children know. They're waiting. Then I realized I had drawn the stick figures from the tree, over and over, their hollow heads staring back at me. That night, the children came closer. I saw them this time, pale, hollow-eyed figures standing among the trees, their bodies swaying as though caught in a breeze I couldn't feel. They didn't speak, but their mouths moved, forming words I couldn't hear. The RV shook violently as the whispering began in earnest, a guttural murmur that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The voices overlapped, growing louder, until they became a deafening roar. I knew then that I couldn't stay. I had to end it. Grabbing the can of gasoline I'd brought for the generator, I headed into the woods, back to the tree. The children followed me, their laughter echoing through the darkness. As I poured the gasoline over the gnarled roots, I heard the whisperer for the first time, a low, rumbling voice that sent shivers down my spine. "Stop," it said. "You cannot undo what is done." I lit the match. The fire roared to life, consuming the tree and its dangling ropes. The children screamed, not in pain, but in relief. As the flames engulfed the branches, their forms dissolved into the smoke, their laughter fading into silence. I stumbled back to my RV, my body trembling. The campground was still, the oppressive weight of the whisperer's presence gone. Without waiting for sunrise, I drove through the night, leaving whispering pines behind. Weeks later, as I was organizing my notes, I found something strange. A page in my notebook I didn't remember writing. Scrawled in a child's handwriting were the words, "We're still here." My name is Sarah Coleman. I'm 31 years old, and this happened last October, just as the Louisiana heat was starting to give way to cooler nights. I had taken my RV to the Atchafalaya Basin for a short solo trip. It was supposed to be a break from my work as a wildlife biologist. A chance to photograph birds, soak in the swamp's eerie beauty, and maybe clear my head after a stressful few months. I've always loved the outdoors. There's something grounding about it, the way nature makes you feel small but connected at the same time. I'm not superstitious by nature. I believe in science, in what can be measured and observed. But the events of that weekend, they've left me questioning more than I ever thought I would. I arrived at the Atchafalaya mid-afternoon, after a long drive down winding roads lined with cypress trees. The air was thick and humid, the kind of dampness that clings to your skin. I found a secluded spot to park my RV near the water, close enough for good views, but far enough from the more crowded camping areas. It was perfect, quiet, with only the sound of cicadas and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. At a gas station just before I reached the basin, I'd met an older fisherman named Roy Tanner. He was friendly enough, but had given me a strange look when I mentioned where I was headed. "Stay on the main paths," he said, shaking his head, "and don't camp near Devil's Hollow." "Devil's Hollow?" I'd asked, amused by the ominous name. He didn't elaborate much, just muttered something about strange happenings in that area. I chalked it up to local legends. Every place like this has them, and they're always colorful. Still, his tone stuck with me. The first day passed uneventfully. I set up camp, unpacked my camera gear, and took a short hike along one of the nearby trails. The swamp was alive with activity. Herons gliding low over the water, turtles sunning themselves on logs, and dragonflies zipping through the air like tiny helicopters. And it was beautiful in its wildness, untamed and ancient. That night, though, the atmosphere shifted. It started with a sound, a low, distant howl that echoed through the swamp. I was inside the RV, editing photos when I heard it. At first, I thought it was a coyote, but the sound was deeper, more guttural. I froze, listening. A second howl answered the first, closer this time. "Wild dogs," I murmured to myself, trying to stay calm. But there was something unnatural about the sound, something that made the hair on my arms stand on end. I locked the RV door before going to bed. The next morning, I decided to explore a less traveled part of the swamp. Armed with my camera, a map, and a water bottle, I ventured off the main trail. The air was heavy with the scent of wet earth and moss, and the canopy of trees above cast the swamp in perpetual twilight. It felt otherworldly, like stepping back in time. That's when I found it, an unnatural clearing in the middle of the swamp. The trees around it were dead, their bark bleached white and brittle. In the center of the clearing was a stone altar, overgrown with moss and vines. It was roughly hewn, its surface pitted and scarred, as if it had weathered centuries of use. Sitting on top of it was a rusted metal collar, engraved with a single word: Cerberus. I should have left it alone, but curiosity got the better of me. I snapped a few photos, examining the collar from a distance. The name stirred something in my memory, a vague recollection of mythology classes from college. Cerberus, the three-headed dog that guarded the gates of the underworld. A sudden chill ran down my spine, and I decided to head back to camp. The trouble began that night. I was sitting in the RV, scrolling through the photos I'd taken when I heard it again. The howling. This time, it was closer. A chorus of low, mournful cries echoed through the swamp surrounding me. I peered out the window but saw nothing. The RV felt too small, too vulnerable. I locked the windows and double-checked the door. The howling stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that the swamp's isolation was playing tricks on me. But then came the scratching. It started as a faint scrape against the RV's metal siding. My breath caught in my throat. The sound grew louder, more deliberate, like claws raking against the walls. I grabbed my hunting knife and stood frozen, listening. Then I heard a low growl, deep and guttural, just outside the door. My heart pounded in my chest as I crept to the window and peered out. What I saw made my blood run cold. Red eyes, glowing like embers in the darkness. They were too high off the ground to belong to a normal dog, and they moved, stalking, circling the RV. A second pair of eyes joined the first, then a third. My hands shook as I backed away from the window, clutching the knife like it was my lifeline. The scratching stopped, replaced by a sound that chilled me to the bone. A deep, rumbling growl that seemed to reverberate through the entire RV. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the first light broke through the trees, I stepped outside cautiously, knife in hand. The ground around the RV was marked with enormous paw prints, far larger than any dog I'd ever seen. My tires had been slashed, the rubber shredded as if by claws. I needed help. I found Roy Tanner near one of the fishing docks and told him everything. He listened in grim silence, his face pale. "You found the altar," he said when I finished. "That's why they're after you." "What are they?" I asked, my voice shaking. "The devil's hounds," he said, his voice low. "Spirits tied to the old legends of this place. They guard the swamp, especially that altar. You must have disturbed something you shouldn't have." I told him about the photos I'd taken, and his expression darkened. "You need to go back," he said. "Put things right, before it's too late." That night, I returned to the clearing. It was the last thing I wanted to do, but I had no choice. The hounds wouldn't stop until they had me, or I appeased them. The swamp was darker than ever, the air thick and oppressive. Every step felt like a journey into the unknown. My flashlight barely cut through the gloom, and the growls started long before I reached the clearing. When I stepped into the dead circle of trees, they were waiting for me. A pack of enormous black hounds, their bodies shifting like smoke, their red eyes fixed on me. They didn't attack, but they didn't back away either. They simply watched, growling low in their throats. I approached the altar slowly, trembling. Pulling the memory card from my camera, I placed it on the stone surface. My voice shook as I spoke. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I didn't mean to disturb you." One of the hounds stepped closer, its massive paws silent on the ground. It growled, baring teeth that shimmered like shards of glass. Desperate, I grabbed my knife and made a shallow cut on my palm, letting a few drops of blood fall onto the altar. The hound sniffed the air, then turned and vanished into the darkness. One by one, the others followed, until I was alone. When I returned to my RV, the air felt lighter, the oppressive weight gone. The RV started without issue, and I drove away from the swamp as fast as I could. Later, when I reviewed the photos on my laptop, I found that the images of the altar were blank, as if they'd been erased. I never posted about the trip, never wrote the blog. Some things are better left undocumented. My name is Tara Mitchell, and I'm 43 years old. This happened last fall, during what was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip in Tunica Hills, Louisiana. It was supposed to be a chance to reconnect with my family, to fix the cracks that had grown between us over the years. But what we found there nearly tore us apart. For good. My husband Mike was the one who suggested the trip. He's 45, and nostalgia runs through his veins. He grew up hiking those hills, always going on about how magical and wild they were. Our daughter, Emma, who had just turned 16, wasn't exactly thrilled. Like any teenager, her idea of bonding didn't include hiking trails and campfire songs. But Mike insisted it would be good for us. So, we packed up our RV and hit the road. The first signs of trouble appeared as soon as we arrived. The campsite Mike picked was at the edge of a ravine, a steep drop surrounded by dense, towering trees. The air was thick, humid, and smelled faintly of moss and decay. Our RV's power system glitched almost immediately. The lights flickered, then went out completely, leaving us fumbling around with flashlights as the sun dipped below the horizon. "Great," Emma muttered, glaring at her phone. "No power, no signal. I love this trip already." Mike forced a chuckle. "It's part of the charm, kiddo. Disconnect for a bit, you might like it." Emma rolled her eyes and went back to sketching in her notebook. She was always drawing, landscapes, people, sometimes strange things she said came to her in dreams. I glanced at the faint outline she was working on. It looked like a series of jagged lines cutting across a tree trunk, though I couldn't tell if it was real or imagined. That night, things got worse. I woke to a faint sound outside the RV. At first, I thought it was just the wind or some animal scurrying through the underbrush. But then I heard it again. A faint giggle, high-pitched and chilling. My heart stopped. It sounded like a child. "Mike?" I whispered, shaking his shoulder. "Did you hear that?" He groaned and rolled over. "Probably just a bird or something," he muttered. I didn't believe him, but I didn't want to argue in the middle of the night. I lay awake, every creak and rustle outside making my skin crawl. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I drifted off. The next morning, I found Emma sitting at the picnic table outside, her sketchbook open. She looked pale, her usual sarcasm replaced by something I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe. "Did you hear something last night?" I asked her. She nodded slowly. "I thought I heard a little kid laughing, but when I looked out the window there was nothing there. It was probably just my imagination." I wanted to believe that, but I couldn't shake the unease settling in my chest. Later that day, we decided to hike Devil's Hollow, a trail Mike remembered from his childhood. He was excited, pointing out landmarks and reminiscing about his adventures as a kid. Emma trailed behind, dragging her feet and muttering under her breath about bugs and blisters. About halfway down the trail, we found her. The girl couldn't have been more than 8 or 9. She was standing in the middle of the path, barefoot, her dress dirty and torn. Her hair hung in limp, tangled strands, and her eyes, wide and unblinking, stared at us as though we were the ghosts, not her. "Hey there," Mike said cautiously, kneeling to her level. "Are you lost? Where are your parents?" The girl didn't answer. She just looked at him, then at me, her eyes lingering on Emma. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" I asked, trying to sound calm. She tilted her head, then spoke in a soft, sing-song voice. "I'm looking for my mommy." Mike exchanged a glance with me, then stood. "Well, let's help you find her. Do you remember where you saw her last?" The girl didn't answer. She just turned and started walking down the trail. Mike shrugged and followed, motioning for us to come along. I didn't want to. Something about the girl felt wrong. But what choice did we have? As we followed her, the trail seemed to change. The trees grew denser, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. The air turned cold, and a strange fog crept in, swirling around our feet. I checked my phone out of habit, still no signal. When I looked up, the girl was gone. "Where'd she go?" Mike asked, spinning in a circle. "I told you this was a bad idea," I hissed, my voice rising with panic. "We should have just stayed at the campsite." "Guys," Emma's voice trembled. "Look." She was pointing at a tree nearby. Carved into its bark was a series of strange symbols, jagged lines and spirals, the same ones Emma had been sketching earlier. My stomach dropped. "Okay, that's it. We're going back," I said, grabbing Emma's arm. But the trail behind us was gone, swallowed by the fog. We were surrounded by trees, all of them marked with those same eerie symbols. That's when we heard the singing. It was faint at first, a child's voice carrying through the mist. Then it grew louder, closer. I couldn't make out the words, but the melody was haunting, like a lullaby sung off-key. Emma clutched my arm, her sketches falling from her hands as she trembled. "Hello?" Mike called, his voice shaking. The singing stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then the fog parted, and we saw her again. The little girl standing at the edge of a clearing. Behind her was a crumbling stone altar covered in what looked like dried blood. My breath caught in my throat. "Why don't you come play?" she said, her voice sweet and sinister. "No," I whispered, backing away. "We're leaving." But as I turned, something cold and slimy brushed against my arm. I spun around and froze. The girl's face had changed. Her eyes were hollow, empty pits, and her mouth twisted into a jagged, unnatural smile. Mike grabbed my hand, pulling me back. "Run," he said. We ran blindly through the fog, the girl's laughter echoing behind us. I could hear Emma sobbing, her footsteps faltering as she struggled to keep up. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't dare stop. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches reaching for us like claws. Then we saw her again, standing in our path. But this time, she wasn't alone. Behind her was a figure, a woman, tall and gaunt, her skin as pale as the fog. Her eyes burned like embers, and her hands, long and twisted, were stained with blood. The witch. She raised one hand, and the ground beneath us seemed to shift and writhe. Roots shot up from the earth, wrapping around Mike's legs and pulling him down. He screamed, clawing at the ground, but the roots held tight. "Let him go!" I screamed, grabbing a branch and hacking at the roots, but they were too strong. Emma stepped forward, her hands trembling as she held up her sketchbook. "Stop!" she shouted. I'll draw you. Isn't that what you want?" The witch tilted her head, her fiery eyes locking on Emma. For a moment, everything was still. Then she nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. "Emma, no!" I shouted, but it was too late. Emma dropped to her knees, furiously sketching. Her pencil flew across the page and I could see the witch's form taking shape. The hollow eyes, the twisted hands, the malevolent grin. As she drew, the witch seemed to falter, her form flickering like a dying flame. "Keep going!" Mike yelled, breaking free from the roots. Emma's hands shook, but she didn't stop. With one final stroke, she finished the drawing, and the witch let out an ear-piercing scream. Her form shattered, dissolving into the fog. The little girl vanished, and the symbols on the trees faded. The fog lifted, and we found ourselves back on the trail, the RV visible in the distance. We didn't speak as we stumbled back to the campsite, our breaths ragged, our hearts pounding. We left Tunica Hills that night, not bothering to pack up properly. None of us could sleep. Even now, months later, I can't stop thinking about that girl, that witch, those symbols. Emma burned her sketchbook, but sometimes I catch her staring at blank pages, her hands twitching as if they want to draw. I don't know what we encountered in those woods, but I know this. We'll never go back. Something ancient and evil lives in Devil's Hollow, and it's still out there waiting. My name is Emma Kavanaugh. I'm 37 years old, and I'm a journalist. Or at least I used to be. This happened in early May last year. I'd recently left my job at a newspaper, a casualty of budget cuts and burnout, and had taken to driving across the country in a beat-up RV, looking for inspiration and maybe a little peace. Instead, I found something I can't explain and will never forget. It began when I heard about Bayou Noir, a secluded RV campground buried deep in the Louisiana swamps. It wasn't on any major maps, but its name came up in old travel forums, tied to stories about a witch, curses, and a place called Belle Ombre. Legends claimed that a woman named Marguerite Duval was accused of witchcraft and hanged in the swamp by angry townsfolk over a century ago. Before she died, she cursed the land, promising to take vengeance on anyone who betrayed her. People said her spirit still haunted the cypress grove near her old home. It sounded like the kind of ghost story people told around campfires, but it was enough to hook me. I figured I could turn the trip into a feature article for one of those supernatural magazines. The Witch of Bayou Noir. It practically wrote itself. But as I drove down the narrow, winding road into the swamp, the air thick with humidity and the sound of cicadas, I started to wonder if I was making a mistake. Bayou Noir wasn't much of a campground. A faded wooden sign marked the entrance, and the gravel road led to a handful of RV pads surrounded by gnarled cypress trees. The place felt abandoned, except for a small office cabin where a wiry, weathered man was sitting on the porch, whittling a piece of wood. "You're the reporter?" he asked when I introduced myself. "Freelancer," I corrected. "Just here to write about the area." He grunted. Name's Amos. I keep the place running. Not many come through anymore. Folks hear the stories, they stay away. You mean the witch? Amos's hand froze, and his eyes darted to the cypress grove in the distance. Don't say her name out loud. Words have power. I couldn't tell if he was being serious or trying to spook me, but the intensity in his voice was unsettling. As he handed me the key to my RV pad, he slipped something else into my hand. A small charm made of twine and feathers. For protection, he said, stay out of the grove, and if you hear her singing, don't follow. I tried to brush it off as local superstition, but the way Amos looked at me, like he was already mourning my fate, sent a chill down my spine. The campground was quiet that evening, the air heavy with the smell of damp earth. I parked my RV near the edge of the swamp, close enough to hear the water lapping gently against the shore. It was peaceful, or at least it should have been, but as night fell, the swamp seemed to change. The sounds of frogs and crickets faded, replaced by an eerie silence. I was sitting at the small table in my RV, reviewing notes I'd gathered about Marguerite Duval, when I heard it. A faint humming, high and melodic, drifting through the trees. I froze, straining to hear. It sounded like a woman singing a lullaby, her voice carrying on the humid breeze. My rational mind told me it was just the wind, but my gut churned with unease. I stepped outside with a flashlight, scanning the dark tree line. The singing stopped, leaving only the sound of my own breathing. I stood there for a long moment, half expecting someone to emerge from the shadows, but the swamp remained still. Shaking my head, I went back inside and locked the door. The next morning, I woke to find muddy footprints outside my RV door. Small, barefoot prints that trailed off towards the cypress grove. I told myself it must have been a prank, maybe some local kids messing with the city girl. But as I stared at the tracks, Amos's warning echoed in my head. If you hear her singing, don't follow. Determined to shake off my nerves, I decided to explore the grove later that day. If there was any truth to the stories, I needed to see for myself. The grove was easy to find, a cluster of ancient cypress trees surrounded by stagnant water. The air there was cooler, and the light seemed dimmer, as though the trees themselves were blocking the sun. At the center of the grove, I found a crude altar, a flat stone covered in moss and surrounded by rusted iron chains. Scattered around it were fragments of bones and what looked like rotting fabric. Nearby, an old iron ring jutted out of the ground, its surface corroded but intact. I realized with a jolt that this was where Marguerite had been hanged. As I crouched to take a closer look, a sudden chill swept over me, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. It felt like I was being watched. I spun around, but no one was there, only the trees, swaying slightly in the breeze. Still, I left the grove quickly, my pulse racing. Back at the campground, I met a young couple parked a few spots away from me. Sarah Harper was chatty and cheerful, the kind of person who could make a friend anywhere. Her husband, Mike, was more reserved, rolling his eyes when Sarah asked if I'd seen the witch. "She loves this spooky crap," he said, shaking his head. That night, Sarah came to my RV, her bubbly demeanor replaced by unease. She said she'd woken up to find Mike gone, only to discover him standing at the edge of the grove, staring into the trees. He claimed he didn't remember how he got there. "That place isn't right," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "I think we should leave." That evening, the humming returned. This time it was closer, louder, and accompanied by faint whispers I couldn't quite make out. I stayed inside the RV, gripping the charm Amos had given me, but the sound seemed to seep through the walls. When I glanced out the window, I saw her. She was standing among the trees, her pale, hollow-eyed face just visible in the moonlight. Her long, tattered dress fluttered as though caught in a breeze, though the air was still. She raised a hand, pointing toward the grove. The lights in my RV flickered and the smell of decay filled the air. I stumbled back, barely able to breathe. When I looked again, she was gone. By morning, Sarah was missing. Mike and I searched the grove together, calling her name, but the swamp seemed to twist around us, the trails looping back on themselves. At the center of the grove, we found her scarf tied to a tree branch. Beneath it, the ground was churned up, as though something, or someone, had been dragged through the mud. "We have to stop her," Mike had said, his voice shaking. "Whatever's out there, it's not human." Amos appeared then, his face grim. He handed me a can of gasoline. "The altar," he said simply. "Destroy it, and maybe she'll leave." We returned to the grove, the swamp eerily silent around us. As I doused the altar in gasoline, the witch appeared, her form shimmering like smoke. Her voice filled the air, low and venomous. "The debt is unpaid," she said, her words twisting into my mind. The trees seemed to come alive, their roots curling toward us like claws. Mike shouted something, but I couldn't hear him over the witch's screams. With trembling hands, I struck a match and threw it onto the altar. The flames roared to life, engulfing the stone and the chains. The witch let out an unearthly wail, her form dissolving into ash as the fire consumed her. The swamp fell silent once more. Mike and I left the campground that night, driving until the first light of dawn. Sarah was never found, and I still see her face in my dreams, calling for help I can't give. Weeks later, I received a package in the mail. The charm Amos had given me, along with a single note that read, "You were warned." I don't know who sent it, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never go back to Bayou Noir. My name is Nina Parker, and I'm 28 years old. This happened in March, just last year. I still wake up in a cold sweat some nights, the sound of Jake's screams echoing in my ears. It's the kind of experience you think you'll never have. Something straight out of a horror movie, the type of thing people tell around campfires to scare you. But I lived it. And if you're smart, you'll stay far away from Bayou Sauvage. It started as a dumb adventure, just a weekend camping trip with my friends for my travel vlog. I'd been building my channel, Wilderness Wanderer, for a couple of years, focusing on offbeat destinations, places most tourists don't bother with. When Jake, my childhood best friend, pitched the idea of filming in Bayou Sauvage, I was immediately intrigued. Swamps were eerie enough on their own, but when Jake mentioned the local legends, especially the story of the Shadowman, I figured it'd make for killer content. "We'll call it Chasing Legends, Louisiana's Shadowman," Jake said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. He was always like that, full of wild ideas, always pushing boundaries. Claire, our quieter, more superstitious friend, wasn't thrilled. "Messing with stuff like that is bad luck," she warned. Jake just laughed. "Come on, Claire. You believe in ghosts now?" Claire didn't argue further, but I could see the worry etched on her face. Jake's boyfriend Eli wasn't thrilled about the idea either. He was mostly tagging along for Jake's sake and made it clear from the start that he thought the whole thing was a bad idea. "You guys have no idea how unprepared you are for this," he muttered as we loaded our cheap gear into the car. By the time we reached Bayou Sauvage, the sun was already starting to dip below the horizon, painting the water in streaks of orange and gold. The air was thick with humidity, and the swamp smelled of damp earth and decay. Cypress trees loomed over us, their gnarled branches dripping with moss. "Creepy as hell," Claire whispered. "Perfect, right?" Jake said, grinning as he pulled out his camera. We set up camp near the edge of the water, a small clearing surrounded by towering trees. Almost immediately, things started going wrong. Jake had forgotten to pack enough bug spray and the mosquitoes were relentless. One of the tent poles snapped as we tried to set up shelter, and my flashlight kept flickering despite fresh batteries. "Top-tier gear, huh?" Eli said sarcastically. Jake rolled his eyes. "Relax. It's an adventure. This is how memories are made." That night, as we sat around the campfire, the swamp came alive with sound. Frogs croaked, insects buzzed, and something splashed in the water nearby. It was a normal swamp noise, I told myself, but there was an undercurrent to it, something faintly off. "Did you hear that?" Claire asked suddenly. "Hear what?" Jake said, chewing on a granola bar. "Like whispering." I strained my ears but heard nothing. "It's probably just the wind," I said, though I didn't entirely believe it. As the night wore on, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. By the time we crawled into our damp, sagging tents, I could have sworn I heard my name. The rain came in the early hours of the morning, a torrential downpour that soaked everything we hadn't packed away. Our cheap gear didn't stand a chance, and by sunrise, we were all soaked to the bone. "This is ridiculous," Eli said, wringing out his jacket. "We need shelter." Jake, ever the optimist, suggested we explore deeper into the swamp. "There's got to be an old cabin or something around here," he said. He was right. About an hour into our trek, we stumbled upon a crumbling hunting cabin perched on stilts above the water. The roof sagged, and the wood was blackened with rot, but it was better than nothing. Inside, the air was stale and heavy, as if the place hadn't been touched in decades. Rusted tools hung on the walls, and a pile of rotting furniture sat in the corner. On one wall, someone had carved a crude symbol, a looping, humanoid figure with outstretched arms. Claire's face went pale. "That's not a good sign." "Looks like a voodoo thing," Jake said, snapping a picture. "Put the camera away," Eli snapped. "Let's just get through the night and leave." That evening, the whispers returned, louder than before. As we huddled in the cabin, the sound seemed to seep through the walls. It wasn't just the wind. It was voices, low and melodic, speaking in a language I didn't understand. And then came the footsteps. They started slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. Claire clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "It's him," she whispered. "The Shadowman." I wanted to tell her she was being ridiculous, but I couldn't. My heart was pounding too hard. When Jake opened the door to look outside, I almost screamed at him to stop. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, the swamp was deathly silent. Then we saw it. A tall, shadowy figure standing just beyond the tree line. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. "What the hell?" Jake whispered. The figure stepped closer, its elongated limbs moving unnaturally. Red eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and my stomach turned as I realized it wasn't casting a shadow of its own. "Close the door," Eli hissed. Jake slammed the door shut and bolted it. "Did you see that? That was insane." Claire was shaking. "We shouldn't have come here. We need to leave, now." As night fell, Jake became different. He was restless, pacing the cabin and muttering to himself. When I tried to talk to him, he snapped at me, something he never did. "I just need some air," he said, shoving past me. He disappeared into the swamp, and when he returned an hour later, his clothes were soaked, and his eyes were distant. "What happened out there?" I asked. He shook his head. "Nothing. I don't remember." But something had changed. Later that night, I woke to the sound of splashing. Jake was gone again, and this time we found him standing waist-deep in the water, staring into the darkness. The Shadowman stood just beyond him, its long fingers brushing against Jake's shoulder. "Jake!" I screamed, but he didn't move. Eli and I rushed into the water, dragging him back to the cabin. His skin was ice cold, and he wouldn't stop whispering, "He's waiting for me." By dawn, we knew we had to leave. The Shadowman was getting bolder, appearing closer to the cabin, his red eyes glowing like embers. Eli and I packed what we could while Claire tried to snap Jake out of his daze. As we paddled through the swamp in our kayak, the water seemed to turn against us. The current shifted unnaturally, pulling us deeper into the bayou instead of towards safety. And then he appeared again, rising from the water like a nightmare. The Shadowman grabbed the kayak, tilting it dangerously. Eli fought him off with a paddle, but the thing's strength was inhuman. Jake stood up suddenly, almost tipping the kayak. "I have to go," he said, his voice eerily calm. "No!" Claire screamed, grabbing his arm. But it was too late. Jake stepped into the water, wading toward the Shadowman. "Jake, don't!" I shouted. But he didn't even look back. The last thing I saw was the Shadowman wrapping his long arms around Jake and dragging him beneath the surface. Eli, Claire, and I barely made it out alive. By the time we reached the edge of the swamp, the Shadowman was gone, but his presence lingered, like a weight pressing down on my chest. We told the police about Jake, but they didn't find a body. "People go missing in the swamp all the time," one officer said. I never posted the footage from that trip. Most of it was corrupted anyway, except for one frame. A blurry image of the Shadowman standing in the water, his red eyes staring directly into the lens. Now, whenever I close my eyes, I see him, and I hear Jake's voice, faint and distant, whispering, "He's waiting for you." My name is Aaron Walsh, and I'm 29 years old. This happened in May of this year, during a solo trip to Chicot State Park in Louisiana. I went there for inspiration, looking for a story to write about for my travel blog. What I found instead has stayed with me, a memory I can't escape no matter how far I travel. I arrived at Chicot State Park on a warm, humid afternoon. The air was thick with the smell of pine needles and stagnant water, the kind of scent that clings to your clothes long after you leave. My RV rumbled into the overgrown parking lot, gravel crunching beneath the tires. The place was quieter than I expected. Too quiet, even for an off-season weekday. I chose this park because it wasn't a popular tourist destination. I wanted solitude, time to think, and space to explore. I'd read about a network of old trails that led to abandoned cabins from a failed settlement in the early 1900s. It sounded perfect, untouched, forgotten, and rich with history. My readers loved stories about places like this. But as I parked near a trailhead that had clearly seen better days, I felt the first prick of unease. The wooden sign marking the trail was rotted and leaning to one side, the words Lakeview Cabin Loop, barely legible beneath a layer of moss. I shook off the feeling. It was just an old park, long past its prime. Nothing more. The hike to the cabin took about an hour. The trail was narrow, overgrown with brambles and roots that snaked across the path like claws. I tripped more than once, cursing under my breath. But when I finally saw the cabin, I forgot my irritation. It was beautiful in the way only abandoned places can be. The weathered wood was blackened with age, the roof sagging, but it still stood stubbornly against time. The forest had started reclaiming it. Vines curling around the beams, moss creeping up the walls. I snapped a few photos, already imagining the blog post I'd write. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the faint scent of rot. Dust motes danced in the sunlight that filtered through the cracks in the walls. There wasn't much left: a broken chair, a rusty bed frame, a pile of decaying newspapers. But in the corner, I saw something that made my skin crawl: a crib. It was small and wooden, barely intact and covered in scratches. Above it, carved into the wall, were the words, "Take us back." I took a step closer, my curiosity outweighing my unease. That's when I saw the toys. A doll with a cracked porcelain face, a wooden train with peeling paint. They sat in the crib arranged neatly, as if waiting for someone to play with them. My camera felt heavy in my hands. I took a photo and left quickly, telling myself I'd seen enough. Back at the RV, I couldn't shake the cabin from my mind. Something about it gnawed at me, like a splinter I couldn't reach. I tried to write, but my thoughts kept circling back to the crib, the words on the wall, the toys. It was around midnight when I heard the first sound: laughter. Faint, high-pitched, and unmistakably that of a child. My heart lurched. I sat frozen, straining to hear over the hum of the RV's generator. The laughter came again, closer this time, followed by a whisper I couldn't make out. I told myself it was just my imagination, the result of too much caffeine and too little sleep. But when I glanced at the window, I saw something that made my blood run cold: a handprint. It was small, too small to be an adult's, and smeared as if the hand had been dragged down the glass. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. There was no way anyone could have reached the window without me hearing them approach. I locked the door and didn't sleep. The next morning I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe I'd brushed against the window earlier and hadn't noticed. Maybe the laughter had been the wind, or a bird. I didn't believe any of it, but it was enough to get me moving again. I decided to return to the cabin. Part of me wanted answers. Part of me just wanted to prove to myself that it was all in my head. The trail felt different this time. The air was heavier, the trees closer, their branches arching overhead like a tunnel. The forest was silent. No birds, no insects, just the crunch of my boots on the dirt. When I reached the cabin, I hesitated at the door. It looked exactly as I'd left it, but something felt wrong. Inside, the toys had moved. The doll was no longer in the crib but sitting on the floor, facing the door as if waiting for me. The train was overturned, one wheel spinning lazily in the still air. My stomach twisted. I backed away, my hands trembling, and nearly tripped over something in the doorway. It was a photograph. Faded and water-stained, it showed a family: a man, a woman, and 3 children. But the children's faces were scratched out, leaving only jagged, empty spaces where their eyes should have been. I didn't stay long after that. That night, the laughter returned. Louder this time and closer. I lay in bed, clutching the flashlight I'd brought with me, my heart pounding in my chest. The handprints were back, more of them now, covering the windows like a child's messy finger painting. "Come play," a voice whispered, soft and sweet, just outside the door. My throat tightened. I didn't move. "Aaron," the voice sang, drawing out the syllables of my name. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed by fear. The laughter turned to sobbing, low and heart-wrenching. Then silence. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside, I saw them. 3 children, their pale faces glowing in the moonlight. They stood at the edge of the forest, just beyond the RV's headlights. Their eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to swallow the light. One of them, a little girl clutching a doll, tilted her head and smiled. "You can be our mommy now," she said. I don't remember how I started the RV. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. The engine roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas, tearing down the narrow dirt road. The children screamed, their voices sharp and piercing, like nails scraping against glass. The RV shook violently as if something, or someone, was trying to climb onto the roof. I didn't look back. It wasn't until I reached the main road that the shaking stopped. The screams faded, replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence. I drove for hours, not stopping until the sun rose and I was far from Chicot State Park. I never wrote about Chicot State Park. The photos I took at the cabin were corrupted, nothing but static and distorted shapes. I told myself I'd imagined it all, that it was some elaborate nightmare brought on by stress. But sometimes, late at night, I hear faint laughter outside my window. And every morning, I check for handprints. I'll never go back to Chicot. If you're ever tempted to visit, don't. Some places are better left forgotten. My name is Lucas Grayson. I'm 34 years old, a freelance photographer, and I swear this happened to me in February of this year. If you think you're brave, curious, or rational enough to face what I did, let me warn you, you're wrong. I've always prided myself on my practicality. Ghost stories are just that, stories. Every strange event has an explanation, and people love to make myths out of shadows and sounds. That's why I laughed when someone warned me about the Devil's Crossing, a rickety old bridge deep in the Atchafalaya Basin. The local woman, who owned the gas station I stopped at, got this faraway look when I asked for nearby landmarks to photograph. "You don't want to go there," she said, shaking her head. "That place don't let people leave the same." I smiled politely and paid for my coffee, not bothering to hide my skepticism. I should have listened. I parked my RV at a secluded pull-off near the swamp, just a mile from the infamous bridge. The air was thick with humidity, the faint scent of decaying wood and damp earth clinging to everything. I loved it. I was here to capture the raw, untouched beauty of the swamp for a photography exhibit. The cypress trees, draped in Spanish moss, rose like ancient sentinels from the murky water. I'd been searching for something hauntingly beautiful to elevate my portfolio. But as I stepped out of the RV, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't just the stillness. Swamps are often quiet, but this was different. The air felt too heavy, as if the swamp itself were watching me. I brushed it off, chalking it up to nerves. That first day passed without incident. I set up my trail cameras, scouted the bridge, and snapped a few test shots. The bridge, weathered and partially submerged, was everything I wanted. Eerie, photogenic, and steeped in local legend. Still, there was something unnerving about it. The planks groaned as I walked across them, even when I stepped lightly. At one point, I noticed a single mud-encrusted shoe lodged between two planks. It was old, too old to belong to anyone recently, but something about it made me shiver. That night, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside the RV. They were deliberate, slow, heavy, and circling. I stayed still, listening, waiting for them to fade, but they didn't. When I finally summoned the courage to peek through the blinds, there was nothing there, just the mist creeping in off the water. The next morning, while checking my trail cameras, I noticed something strange. Every photo taken near the bridge was distorted, blurry, smeared, or overexposed. One shot stood out. It captured the bridge perfectly, but there was a faint shadow standing at the center. It looked like a person, but it was too tall, too thin. On my way back to the RV, I stumbled across an old, leather-bound diary buried in the mud. Its pages were water-stained and fragile, but I could still make out some of the entries. They spoke of a shadowy figure near the bridge, glowing red eyes in the mist. and the screams of those who dared to cross it. The final entry chilled me. Do not cross the bridge. The devil takes those who do. I laughed nervously, feeling a twinge of unease. It was probably just an old prank, I told myself, some kid's idea of a scary story. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow in the photo and the shadow in the diary were one and the same. That night, the footsteps returned, but this time they were accompanied by a voice. Lucas. It was faint, barely audible over the sounds of the swamp. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Lucas. It was my brother's voice. My heart clenched. My brother Sean had died 3 years ago in a car accident. We hadn't spoken in years, not since I'd declined to photograph his wedding. I threw open the door, expecting to see what? Him? But there was nothing there. Only the bridge, shrouded in mist, glowing faintly in the moonlight. Lucas. The voice came again, this time from the direction of the bridge. My rational mind screamed at me to go back inside, to lock the door and forget about this whole trip. But guilt is a powerful thing. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the bridge. The closer I got, the thicker the mist became. It swirled around me, muffling the world and making the swamp feel endless. The bridge loomed ahead, its wooden planks slick with moss and water. Sean, I called out, my voice trembling. There was no answer, but I swore I saw movement at the far end of the bridge, a shadow slipping between the trees. As I stepped onto the first plank, the air seemed to vibrate. The groaning wood sounded almost like a low, guttural growl. Come closer, Lucas, Sean's voice said, clearer now. I inched forward, my flashlight cutting through the fog. The shadow was there, standing in the center of the bridge. It was tall, unnaturally so, with glowing red eyes that pierced the darkness. Sean, I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure tilted its head, its smile stretching too wide, too sharp. Cross, it said, its voice a perfect mimic of my brother's. Come to me. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but then the figure stepped closer, its long limbs creaking like the planks beneath my feet. You left me, it said, its voice dripping with malice. No, I whispered, you're not him. You're not Sean. The figure's smile widened, its eyes burning brighter. You can see him again, it said, just one step more. The mist swirled violently, the bridge groaning as if under tremendous weight. Shadows darted at the edges of my vision, their whispers blending into a cacophony of voices. Cross the bridge. Stay with us. You'll never leave. I stumbled back, nearly losing my footing. My flashlight flickered, plunging me into darkness. I turned and ran, the whispers turning into screams that chased me back to the RV. As I reached the door, I felt something cold brush against my neck. A hand, skeletal and wet. I threw myself inside, slamming the door and locking it. The RV shook violently as something pounded on the walls, the roof, the windows. Lucas, the voice said again, now right outside. I pressed my hands over my ears, willing it to stop. After what felt like hours, the pounding ceased. When I finally dared to look outside, the mist was gone, and the swamp was silent. But as I started the engine and pulled away, I caught one last glimpse of the bridge in my rearview mirror. The figure was there, standing at the edge, its red eyes watching me leave. I made it out of the swamp alive, but I wasn't the same. The photos I'd taken were gone, wiped from every device. The diary disappeared from my bag. And at night, I still hear Sean's voice calling to me. I know better than to answer. If you ever find yourself near the Devil's Crossing, do yourself a favor, turn around. some things are meant to stay forgotten. My name is Mia Caldwell, and I'm 27 years old. This happened in October 2023, during what should have been a simple camping trip with my best friend. Instead, it turned into a nightmare I'll never escape. Harper and I had been planning this trip for months. She wanted adventure. I wanted reconnection. It had been years since we'd spent quality time together, and Harper's relentless energy made me nostalgic for the way things used to be in college. So, when she suggested an RV trip through Louisiana, I agreed, despite my preference for creature comforts. Our destination was Tunica Hills Wildlife Management Area, a rugged patch of forest known for its steep trails and hidden waterfalls. It sounded perfect, beautiful, remote, and quiet. I hoped the trip would mend the cracks that had formed in our friendship. But now, as I sit in the silence of my empty RV, driving away from that cursed forest, I know better. I'll never forget what happened there. Or what I lost. The trouble started before we even parked the RV. We'd been driving for hours, winding through narrow back roads and gravel paths, when the GPS suddenly lost signal. Harper laughed it off, calling it part of the adventure. "It's a sign we're truly off the grid," she said, flashing me her wide, infectious grin. I didn't find it so funny. The sun was already sinking low, and I wasn't thrilled about arriving at our campsite in the dark. But Harper, ever fearless, pushed on. She found a disused trailhead marked with a rusted sign that read, La Flor Trail, Est 1,898 inches, and insisted it was the perfect spot to camp. The moment we stepped out of the RV, a sense of unease settled over me. The forest felt too quiet. The kind of silence that pressed against your ears and made you hyper-aware of every rustle and snap. Harper didn't notice, or if she did, she ignored it. She was already unloading gear, her boundless energy making me feel like the cautious, boring friend I always feared she thought I was. "We'll set up here," she said, slinging her camera around her neck. "You'll love it once you see the stars." The eeriness began with small things. As we built our campfire, I noticed footprints near the RV. They were too large for mine and too narrow for Harper's, but she waved it off as probably from some hiker ages ago. That didn't make sense. These prints were fresh, perfectly outlined in the damp soil. But I didn't argue. Then the noises started. It began as a faint whistling from deep in the trees. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it was too deliberate, too melodic. Harper teased me, saying it was probably the rougarou, the Cajun werewolf of local folklore. "It's a full moon tonight," she joked, wiggling her eyebrows. I didn't laugh. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Later that night, as I lay in my bunk in the RV, I heard something scratching at the door. The sound was soft, almost tentative, but it sent my heart racing. I stayed frozen, listening, until it stopped. In the morning, I found deep scratches on the door's paint. Harper laughed it off, saying it was probably a raccoon. "You're too jumpy," she said, handing me a cup of instant coffee. But I knew those marks weren't from an animal. The next day, Harper convinced me to hike deeper into the forest. I didn't want to go. I'd already decided I didn't like this place. But I didn't want to seem like a killjoy either. The trail wound through dense pines and oaks, the air thick with humidity. Harper was in her element, snapping photos of moss-covered rocks and teasing me whenever I stopped to catch my breath. "Come on, Mia. Where's your sense of adventure?" she called, her voice echoing through the trees. We'd been hiking for about an hour when Harper stopped abruptly. "Did you see that?" she asked, pointing ahead. I squinted but saw nothing unusual, just trees and underbrush. "There," she insisted. Something moved, I didn't see anything, but I felt it. The oppressive silence again, like the forest was holding its breath. Harper brushed it off, but I could tell she was spooked. Things only got worse. At one point, we came across a circle of stones arranged neatly on the ground. They looked ancient, their surfaces worn smooth, and I felt an inexplicable chill standing near them. Harper snapped a photo, but even she seemed uneasy. We decided to head back, but somehow we got turned around. The trail markers we'd been following vanished, and Harper's phone, our backup map, was dead despite being fully charged that morning. Back at the campsite, we found something we hadn't noticed before. A small leather-bound journal, half buried in the dirt near the fire pit. Curious, Harper opened it. The pages were filled with rambling entries about humanoid figures in the woods, voices calling out in the night, and something the writer called the Mimic. "It's probably some wannabe horror writer's notebook," Harper said, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. That night, the strange whistling returned, louder this time. And then came the voices. It started as a faint, far-off sound, a woman's voice calling, "Help me." Harper perked up, her instinct to help kicking in. "Mia, did you hear that? Someone's out there." "No," I said firmly, "we're not going out there. It's probably some animal." But Harper wouldn't listen. She grabbed the flashlight and stormed outside, leaving me no choice but to follow. The voice called again, closer now. "Help me, please." We searched the perimeter of the campsite but found nothing. Harper insisted we go deeper into the woods, but I grabbed her arm. "Stop," I said, my voice shaking. "Something's wrong. We're going back to the RV." Reluctantly, she agreed. The next morning, Harper was gone. At first, I thought she'd gone to take photos. But when an hour passed with no sign of her, I started to panic. I called her name, my voice echoing through the silent woods. Then I heard it, her voice calling back, "Mia, over here!" Relief flooded me, and I followed the sound. But as I got closer, I realized something was off. The voice was coming from deep in the forest, far from any trail. "Harper!" I shouted. "Here, Mia!" the voice answered. It sounded like Harper, but not quite. There was a flatness to it, an unnatural tone that made my stomach churn. I stopped, fear rooting me in place. That's when I saw her. She was standing between two trees, her back to me. "Harper?" I called, hesitantly. She turned slowly, too slowly, and my blood turned to ice. Her face, if it was her face, was wrong. Her eyes were too wide, her smile stretched unnaturally across her face. And then she spoke again, her voice dripping with malice. "Come closer, Mia." I ran. Back at the RV, I locked the door and tried to calm my racing heart. I didn't know what I'd seen, but I knew it wasn't Harper. As the sun set, the banging started. Something pounded on the RV walls, rocking the vehicle violently. Through the window, I saw shadows moving outside, too tall and too thin to be human. And then came her voice again. "Mia, let me in. It's me, Harper." I knew better, but the sound of her voice broke something in me. "Where are you?" I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "Right here," the voice answered, now right outside the door. I didn't open it. Instead, I started the engine and gunned it, speeding down the narrow, winding trail as fast as I dared. The banging stopped, but the shadows didn't. They followed me, darting between the trees, their glowing eyes piercing the darkness. Hours later, I reached the highway. My hands were trembling, my body soaked in sweat. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and there she was. Harper, standing on the roadside, her face twisted into that same unnatural smile. I didn't stop. I don't know what happened to Harper. Maybe she's still out there, wandering the forest. Maybe she's gone. but I can still hear her voice sometimes, calling to me in the night. I'll never go back to Tunica Hills, and if you're smart, you won't either.